Hi everyone, welcome to this session on building resilience for the digital gig economy. As some of you will be aware, we've had a couple sessions looking at how we can use technology to within our employment programming to improve employment, in particular thinking about digital workers. And so far we've had a number of calls where we've talked about how to use technology to maximize the efficiency of labor markets, how to improve the accessibility of labor markets to excluded groups. And today we're going to be talking about labor market and worker resilience. And so these calls are partly been inspired by the closure of Youth Impact Labs after several years. We're now looking back to try to understand some of the lessons learned from this multi-year Google-funded program. And Youth Impact Labs has tried to work with, I think, over 20 digital technology innovators in the Middle East and East Africa, focusing on Kenya and Jordan. A number of online gig work platforms, working with consultancies that are developing digital supply chain solutions or human resource solutions, helping them to grow and expand their services to improve employment. So we have some lessons to share, but we're also so grateful to all the other people who have been joining our sessions as well. And we have some really great speakers here to share all their insights and experiences as well. Thanks to all of you who tuned in today. Just to mention that if you have any questions, please put them in as we go along, and we'll make sure we'll be speaking for about 45 minutes with a Q&A at the end. And if you could just put any questions into the comment section on Facebook Live, we'll get to them. Any IT issues, your microphone's not, my microphone's not working, but if you're having any issues you can't hear properly, just put it in there as well. If this connection breaks, just go back to the registration page. So today, right now, we're going to be talking about how the resilience of digital workers, and there's probably no bigger disruptor than how COVID-19 has affected gig workers and the wider gig economy. So we'll be talking in particular about what COVID-19 has done to digital gig workers. In what ways has the digital economy increased worker resilience? So though we're seeing such large numbers of workers who've lost their jobs, we'll be trying to get into the nuance to understand the differences between sectors and ways that digital economy has supported resilience. We'll also look at ways where it may have decreased resilience or may not have sufficiently allowed workers to respond to COVID-19. And perhaps the most important thing is to kind of take from our great speakers here to understand what we as a community can do going forward to improve the resilience of gig work. So there's a bit of context for, I imagine for many of you, this might not be needed. The digital gig economy is growing at a very fast scale. I put some numbers up there to demonstrate that. And that's really a global phenomena, though big differences in different places. But for instance, our research in Kenya shows the online gig economy growing threefold over 4 years. Despite that growth, for a number of years, there's been many concerns over the quality of gig work, such as job insecurity, perhaps a lack of legal protection for workers, concerns that governments and employers are using this as a way to not have to handle some of their responsibilities, concerns over the power of platforms. So gig work can be very empowering in some ways. In other ways, workers are potentially, there's an power imbalance between the owners of the platforms, and in some cases, concerns about how algorithms work. Workers don't have are not able to look into. Into that, we have COVID-19 that has devastated employment globally. The ILO's latest figures show that if you compare Q2 of 2020 to the last quarter before the crisis, quarter by quarter basis, we see 305 million jobs lost. It's a staggering number. For the digital gig economy, the losses of jobs has also been staggering, in part just due to this has been a massive fall in aggregate demand across many economies. So many jobs have been lost. But within that, there's been a lot of differences between different sectors that I'll come into the next slide. in many places we're seeing or wondering, are digital workers more resilient to the collapse because of the technologies they're working through? So as I mentioned, we work, Youth Impact Labs works in the Middle East and East Africa. And we've done some research with some of our partners to understand some of the impacts on them of COVID-19. So again, some of this may not be a surprise, but a large number of workers saw a fall in incomes. So Link is a partner we support. Link is an online platform in Kenya, where let's say if you were in Nairobi, you wanted to find as a customer, a carpenter, a handyman, electrician, a beautician, it's a platform where you could reach out and find someone. Sky Garden is an online marketplace that supports micro entrepreneurs to come in and sell their goods to buyers. And what we're seeing across these is a big fall in incomes, largely driven by this decrease in demand, but also in other places, logistics disruption, as people are not able to access inputs or things that they would sell on. That said, there's a lot of differences within that. On online platforms, the job losses have been hardest hit, unsurprisingly, in sectors that require face-to-face contact, let's say beautician work or kind of handymen in your house. So those have fallen the most, whereas other sectors, and Anna will tell us more about this later, we're seeing opportunities perhaps in other sectors such as cleaning, disinfection. Sky Garden saw a big fall in demand for a lot of, let's say, day-to-day products or non-necessary products on its platform, but a big increase in basic requirements for basic necessities, for packaged food, for kind of sanitary goods. People who would normally go to the shops to buy these were concerned and buying them online. Anyway, just to highlight the kind of differences we're seeing, the nuances that are coming out. But that said, as a whole, the impacts have been very hard. 80% of households have delayed or skipped rent in our surveys, for instance. For Sky Garden, some of the top strategies for micro merchants, that's not a surprise, were around reduced spending on marketing as any non-crucial costs have been cut, laying off workers, defaulting on rent, and moving products online. At Youth Impact Labs, our support in a number of cases has been to provide gig workers through platforms some cash support as a kind of emergency response, working in a number of countries with local cash coordinating committees, with governments, but also recognizing that these platforms are actually a very good way, efficient way to transfer cash because they are able to have clear records of people's incomes and accessibility. However, our bigger focus, especially going forward, is more about helping online platforms to adapt and pivot their business models. So, for instance, with Sky Garden, as I mentioned earlier, we help them pivot towards focusing on being an online platform for basic goods. Similarly, with Built for On in Kenya, which was a home cooking platform for chefs at home to sell their goods, we helped them to move to becoming more an e-logistics platform that would sell food through the platform, help them develop a partnership with a logistics company. Gitboda in Kenya is an online platform, online logistics platform to find a courier service. We worked with a platform to provide protective equipment to their employees, and also to expand partnerships with restaurants and with other large businesses that were looking for that service, are helping with working capital, legal expertise. So that's a bit on what we've been in my context. So here, I'll introduce themselves.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. So my name is Ezana Raswork. I'm the managing director of Taskmobi. Taskmobi is the first digital marketplace in Ethiopia that connects youth with users looking for home services. Essentially, the problem that we're solving is that we have about 70% unemployment around young people that graduate from vocational schools. And on the other end, you have 80% of users in Ethiopia saying they have a tough time finding reliable service providers. So essentially what our platform does is connects these two worlds together.
Thanks very much. And Michelle?
Thanks, Ashley. So I'm Michelle Hassan. I am the country lead for BFA Global, as well as Catalyst Fund, which is actually powered by BFA. Catalyst Fund is an accelerator program that supports early stage startups in emerging markets, with Kenya being one of them, South Africa, Nigeria, India, and Mexico. So glad to be here.
Thanks so much. And Shami?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sharmi Ryan. I'm the Chief Impact Officer for Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator. We address the challenge of youth unemployment at scale through partnerships, especially with government. And we have a presence in South Africa and Rwanda. We're demand-led, youth-centered, and technology-enabled. And I'm really excited to be part of this conversation.
It's great to have you all here. So the first thing I want to ask, and I'm going to first of all ask Ezana, is how is COVID-19 affecting digital gig workers? I mean, Ezana, your platform is doing exactly this. What are you seeing?
Very mixed. So it's had a severe negative impact, and that we find the variance by category. So in some categories, so for example, in plumbing and electrical services, where those gig workers are primarily servicing people at home, they've been very negatively impacted. So maybe somewhere between 60 to 80% reduction in income, simply by the fact that they can't go to people's homes during the lockdown. So that was on the downside. But what we have found is that in some categories, it's been a very positive impact. And that's in specific around the cleaning and disinfection service. So as you can imagine, the demand for disinfection services, particularly in public areas, in open offices, has seen a significant increase. So with some work from the Youth Impact Labs, we've pivoted our platform to provide more work in that area. So I'd say it's a mixed picture based on which categories we're addressing.
Michelle, I mean, I know you have a lot of background in the financial diaries. And what's your perspective on this?
I think, first of all, we need to understand, like in Kenya, there were kind of key restrictions and measures that were put in place immediately that had a big impact to digital workers. So measures like how many passengers are able to stay in a vehicle. There was a closing of restaurants and bars. And also there was a curfew in Kenya. So we've seen that as actually having a great impact for digital gig workers. But as Enza said, the impact actually varied based on the sector. So we saw platforms that actually facilitate logistics and movement of goods reporting a surge in businesses. But the ones that are offering the artisanal or personal services, they actually went down, as even according to a SIGUP study, up to 90%. So they actually was varied based on the sector they were in.
Thanks. Shami, what's your perspective on this?
Sure, and I think I'm going to recap some of what Ezana and Michelle said. And for me, I think both being a resident of Kenya, but working in South Africa and Rwanda, I think the impact on gig work has been threefold. And sort of to give it a bit of a frame, it has an impact on highlighting the precariousness of gig work, also highlighting the potential of gig work, and then underscoring the lack of preparedness that we have as systems and institutions, sort of the 3 Ps, as I'd like to call it. And precariousness, I think Ezana and Michelle have really captured it really well. You know, face-to-face services and personal services have gone down dramatically, but also really highlighting that it's because COVID-19 was such a huge demand-side shock, consumers were forced to not spend as much, and the precariousness of gig work relies heavily on people having enough money to actually spend on opportunities. The potential for gig work is what, Michelle talked about, with Kenya in particular, seeing so many interesting innovations where you had grocery stores and supermarkets clubbing together with logistics delivery companies to actually bundle together services for home deliveries, etc. So there's so much potential that actually highlights and underscores the future of work. and in many ways, COVID accelerated some of that. And the third P is preparedness. I think for me, COVID really underscores the lack of preparedness that we have as an economy, as societies and systems, and more importantly, as institutions for this kind of work. We think that, gig work is probably going to be the new normal, whereas you had informal sector being kind of seen as pre-formal, and you had formal sector jobs shrinking in many countries, especially on the continent. I think you're going to see gig work emerging as a new and more important form of work. And I think it's the job of governments, private sector, and many institutions to really catch up, to be prepared for this future of work. So yeah, I mean, in South Africa, we've seen, hustle work on the rise, but very much lack of social protection and a huge precariousness that we all need to sort of pay attention to.
Those are really great points. And I want to come back later on really to talk about some of those issues, the preparedness, issues around social security and the role of the government. Something I wanted to touch on now, I know it interests you a lot, and I think Michelle, maybe all of us, is around how this relates to the digital divide. I know a lot of your work, Sharmi, is looking at how to address that. And how are you seeing kind of digital gig workers are more resilient than non-digital gig workers? What more can we do in this space?
Sure. I think for us in South Africa, for example, we as Harambee play a role as the National Pathway Manager as part of an initiative called the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention. And what that does is it allows young people to access data-free, either a platform, a network of networks, if you will, of opportunities, and have visibility to various opportunities, whether they're in the formal sector or in the informal economy. We've seen through COVID, and when we tried to actually launch several campaigns through COVID to reach out to young people who were quite desperate, out of job and not knowing what to do, we formulated a campaign to try and reach 6 million youth to get them busy and keeping them occupied during COVID. But it was clear, and my colleagues will probably share this, that data was a huge issue. Smartphone access was pretty reasonable, but young people, even if they had a smartphone, couldn't pay for data to actually access many of the opportunities that did go online. And I know that many opportunities turned online and pivoted for those several hard months of lockdown across the continent. We made our Mobi site data free. So we took the decision to have a site, sayouth.mobi. We actually reverse charged the data costs to Harambee. And we noticed a dramatic improvement in the number of hits we had to our website, to our Mobi site. And then just this week, actually, we've introduced a toll-free hotline where unemployed young people can call our hotline to receive employability interventions. The digital divide is going to be the biggest barrier to inclusion, just because young people, even if they are in urban areas, do have a smartphone, may not be able to access the internet, and the cost of data are incredibly high. And the second piece is many of them don't have digital skills. So I think much as there's a rise in innovation for platform work, many young people don't know how to sell themselves online, to access those jobs, or if they do have products and are entrepreneurs themselves, are not digitally ready. So there's a skilling aspect to this as well, in terms of enabling young people to become competent in the digital age.
Thanks. I don't know if Michelle or Ezana, you'd like to add something to that.
Yeah, I would like to add something. I think I agree with Sharmi. The digital divide is actually a really big barrier. Even when you look at the e-commerce platform and everything, it's mostly situated only in urban areas and peri-urban areas. So how do we start accessing it outside those areas so that more people are able to get it? For me, I feel like that's a still big issue. Also during this whole period, we've seen a lot of businesses trying to get online. But what does that mean? I think a lot of people just assumed, if I put my business on Facebook or on Instagram, I'm able to get more money and everything. And that's how also the young people are trying to get access. But trying to get the journey of how to make businesses go online, also how to actually start doing online businesses is still a challenge for a lot of, I think, countries, and that we need to actually have like a platform or a pathway to doing that.
I agree with both what Sharmi and Michelle have mentioned. So essentially for us, we've gone to where the market is as opposed to waiting for the market to come to us. By that, I mean, when we pivoted towards providing work for domestic workers, we find that the penetration of smartphones is very low amongst that group of women. So most of our services we provided through our call center. So if we were waiting for those that had smartphones to be available, I don't think we would have been able to provide a service. So we provided an overlay, which is whereas those that do have access to a smartphone and data, they receive the jobs where they should be and how much they get paid through the application. We didn't actually most of the jobs and tasks that we provided were funneled through the call center. We were following up, so a lot of work on our end, but certainly that's how we managed to find the gap, bridge the gap to make sure that they were at the right place at the right time and be able to earn the income. And over time, we'll manage to get them to merge, to migrate over to the fully digital platform. But in the meantime, particularly in Ethiopia, it would have been a constraint if we only relied on those that were fully ready, enabled with data. So there is an extra cost or extra effort involved, but certainly we saw the same thing around the limitations of relying only on, digitally enabled workers.
Thanks very much. Sorry, Michelle.
Yeah, can I jump in there? I was actually even thinking about financial institutions, right? Because it's a big part in terms of employment rewired and everything. And during this whole period, it showed how not digitally abled most of the financial institutions are. They had to reach a point of saying, now, because of the number of people who have to come to the branches and everything has to reduce, we need to move on either to an agent model or through digital platforms. And we've seen that a kind of a big barrier because a lot of organizations or even actually financial institutions did not know how to do that. We had one of our startups, which is called Quara, trying to help SACCOs actually get online. Immediately they realized they were struggling or I need to reach my end consumers. How do I do that? Because they don't have a smartphone. Neither do I need to actually do all these measures for COVID response. So I think it was interesting to see how types of innovations that have come up even in the financial sector just because of COVID.
Well, that seems like the perfect segue. I mean, I think the conversation is, as we talk about the resilience of labour markets of workers, definitely we shouldn't be forgetting the concerns around the digital divide. But to follow that point, I'd be curious to ask you all about in your work, how you've been pivoting your work. You're some of the leading thinkers about how to make labour markets more resilient, how to increase jobs. So Medizana, I can pass over to you. What kind of changes have you overseen in response to COVID-19?
I'd say two major ones. And actually part of this was supported by the Youth Impact Lab, the work that you've done. The one was pivoting towards B2B and secondly towards cleaning disinfection. The first one in terms of B2B, so whereas we found business to business, so whereas we found that individual homes were more reluctant to have a service provider come to their home, be it a plumber, electrician, a domestic worker. I'm nervous, I'm afraid, therefore I will use less of that service. There's of course an income drop, which also underlies, which also is a factor. What we found is that there are areas where the work continued. So one would be in construction. And also there were some office workers like in government that continued to work throughout this period of time. So we found that there was an opportunity to provide services to businesses, so construction companies, where some of our workers we could redeploy to provide services to them at scale. So that was one change we saw. Also government, so we worked, for example, with the Ministry of Tourism that was looking to ensure that the museums, all the historical sites were properly disinfected to reopen for tourism. It hasn't necessarily materialized yet, but at least getting ready for that. So we found that working with partners or strategic partnerships has been something we focused in on and adapted our business model to be able to support them. And then the second thing I mentioned was around the disinfection work. So we were primarily looking at cleaning. When this came up, we got rapidly trained up with a Norwegian company around how to train and provide disinfection services. And we found that that's been sort of a significant growth area. So marrying both the need to create safe environments, particularly public safe environments, together with a significant need to employ domestic workers, many of them coming back from the Middle East, some of them that are locally employed, that had been laid off. So we managed to absorb around 300 of them now, and then that's going to ramp up to about 1,000, where we can find meaningful work in the cleaning and disinfection, which I guess is something that that is unfortunately going to be with us for a while.
Thanks. And maybe Michelle, I'd love to hear from you there. And are you ready for the next outbreak, for the next level of restrictions? Like how ready are you for the future?
That's a very good question. We have been thinking about different scenarios of what will happen next. And as part of BFA, I think during this whole period, we've been working with organizations like FSD Kenya to sort of give more people feedback on what's been happening. I think if you see online, we've been doing the financial diaries to tell people what are the effects are, as well as kind of do the dipstick survey initially to just say, here's the situation. And we're hoping that through that, people are able to kind of create different scenarios of what needs to happen. So for us, I think we think about how do we create things like insurance for gig workers or all these other social support that enables them so that next time, if it ever happens again, people are actually well covered. Because from our research, we found out people kept on saying, oh, I only have money for about 4 weeks. So if I don't get a job within 4 weeks, I don't know what will happen. So trying to actually build up resilient products that can support gig workers in case anything happens. And not just only gig workers, but everyone. In case something like this ever happens, they have a safety net to bank on.
Thanks so much, Shomi. I know your work covers such diverse areas. Maybe you could tell us on this as well.
Sure. Maybe just quick points. One was a sort of semi-permanent pivot and 3 or 4 permanent pivots. So one big pivot that we made as Harambee, our call center, which powers our labor force sort of interactive channel in South Africa, lay dormant during the first sort of hardest part of South Africa's lockdown. We were approached by the Department of Employment and Labor to actually then second our call center staff capacity to instead take calls and disperse the unemployment insurance fund for a period of 6 to 8 weeks, actually. So we served and were seconded to government to disperse probably the largest UIF disbursement in South Africa. So that was the biggest pivot. And that was a temporary pivot, and it ended in June, but it taught us some really interesting lessons in terms of using calls as a mechanism to engage with young people. So the second set of pivots to describe are the fact that we went online and we went old school. So online, we moved all of our face-to-face programming with our young people. We moved it online and made it all data free and data light because they told us they didn't have data. And we went old school, learning from the call center experience. We pivoted our call center to instead work with SMS, WhatsApp, chatbot, and then now we have just launched our inbound toll-free hotline for young people in South Africa, which is super exciting. So I think I can't undermine enough the, overemphasize rather the importance of being sensitive to data needs. So I think old school, outdated technologies are really important. Then 2 other sort of pivots that are worth mentioning. We've gone heavily invested into the space of the informal economy, both in terms of the hustle and understanding gig work and gig platforms. So we're partnering more with job aggregators as well as labor market platforms in South Africa, the Can-Doers of the world, Adzuna, Giraffe, to bring those opportunities to our young people. And the second is we're trying to work extensively with government to understand public works programs, because those are really critical programs in deep recessions to help absorb young people, even in short-term experiences. So yeah, those are some of the pivots that we've undertaken over the past few months.
Okay, thanks very much. I see we have some quite exciting questions coming in. So I'll make this the last question to everyone now. How can we support gig work to be more resilient to future shocks and stresses? And Shomi, I'll turn this to you first. I don't know if you want to talk about issues around the role of the government or social security that you mentioned earlier, or anything else that you feel is important.
Sure. I think, like I mentioned in the beginning around preparedness, the lack of preparedness, I think it's really exposed kind of gaps in how we think about gig and informal work in the future. And I do think governments, private sector, citizens actually can do really interesting things. And so I'll be quite action oriented. We all may have read the article by Uber CEO talking about benefits funds that are actually pooled and not restricted to a specific employer. So I think social protection and insurance and medical, etc., offering that as an employer, but importantly, looking at innovative ways in which to do that. I know that For example, Kenya has a really interesting micro pension service, Zamara, that's on the market for informal sector workers. That's, products such as those, I think the private sector, like Michelle was talking about earlier, the financial sector can actually be quite innovative in this space to catch up with the innovations that are already happening in the gig space. Secondly, and this is something that's very close to our heart in Harambee, is transferability of credentials. Even if gig platforms individually have ratings and rankings, etc., those often end up staying with the employer rather than the individual. And that really doesn't serve a labor market pool altogether. So I think as Harambee, we're trying to ensure that credentials are both portable, but also transferable across multiple platforms. And then the last thing would be visibility to opportunities, especially to excluded youth. I think the government here in particular can play a role in terms of either platform aggregators, like what we're doing in South Africa, and there's a possibility in other countries and contexts as well for them to actively aggregate and curate opportunities for young people to have easier access to those.
Amazing points. And Michelle, I'm sure you could add to that, but while we have you here, I'm wondering about the role of finance. I don't know if you could talk to anything about how finance could make gig work more resilient, and also is that just access to credit, or is there potential for other types of financial products to come in?
Yeah, thank you. We have been thinking about embedded finance, so not just only finance, but you can give access to credit with a top up of something like an insurance product and things like that, which we feel like it's much more important in creating in terms of resilience. We have seen in some of the gig workers here in Kenya, like with Safe Border, having a partnership with Turaco to actually offer that access to insurance for their workers. So that is something interesting. But as mentioned before, I think it's the financial institutions that have to come up with innovative ways of ensuring how do we actually play around. Is it a savings product that with the platforms, right? Financial institution work with the platform to say for every ride, scrap off like 10 shillings or even 20% to actually put it in a savings product so that in case something like this ever happens again, there is a safety net for that. So coming up with ideas of how to do more savings and also having more partnership with insurance startups or even gig economies to just have that access for them. I think it's important.
Thanks, Nizana. I'd love to hear what's your view on how we can make gig work more resilient. I know you have so much experience in this area.
Sort of two things. I think I definitely echo the need in terms of the social safety net that the platform can provide. We are looking at that quite closely. So we're working with Mercy Corps in Ethiopia to provide a financial guarantor program with a microfinance institution as well. So looking at how we can provide some guarantees for the gig workers. There's a task force by the Job Creation Commission where we're looking at those issues as an industry, sort of as a platform, as opposed to just Taskmobi by itself, which helps. So it looks like we're all working to find similar solutions, and maybe approaching it as an industry will give us a better chance of success with the support of both private players in the private platforms together with the Creation Commission, which is a government organ. So certainly looking at different solutions to that that we're looking to pursue. The one thing that I do think has come out of this is that the ability of the platform to deploy, I think this might have been mentioned in the beginning, the ability of the platform to deploy support to a large number of workers efficiently, I think it's something that we've learned, is that we were able to onboard, train, deploy. It's in the hundreds now, probably increase in the thousands, particularly in the domestic workers. I think from our standpoint was a learning, but I think it also was a learning for the Job Creation Commission and the Mercy Corps team that we're working with in Ethiopia as an efficient way to be able to deploy relief or financial support to a large group of vulnerable people with the mechanisms behind to track it. So I do think that's a learning and something that I believe has legs. So we are looking at what would be a phase 2 for that intervention. So I think that also as a way to provide relief, so the platform itself and the workers, but also as a way to provide relief to a large number of people. I think that the gig platforms in this instance, I think, have proven themselves to be a worthy partner.
Feels like a great note to end things on. Would any of you like to add anything to something you feel you would like to, you didn't have a chance to say, or any comments on anyone else? Otherwise, we'll go to questions now. Great. Okay. Well, let's go over to all of our exciting questions now. The first one I want to ask our panelists came from the registration page earlier, and we've been talking a lot about COVID-19. I want to ask our panelists, beyond COVID-19, which is clearly this massive ongoing risk, what are the other major risks that you see to the resilience of the gig economy and to gig workers in the future? I don't know if we have any initial takers for that.
Just some thoughts on that, Ashley. I do think that COVID has been a test for the, so for at least, I can speak mostly for the Ethiopian context in terms of our platform. What I think is that, COVID has managed to put focus around where there might be some challenges in terms of providing, ongoing work to the workers on the platform. So I do think that what we need to do going forward is create an environment that is viable for the platforms. And I think it goes back to the kinds of issues that we've talked about earlier. So it would be the regulatory environment, which I think needs to be, at least in the Ethiopian context, needs to be more stable for the platforms to continue to thrive. If they do, that creates value for the workers themselves. I think the licensing, as well as the ability for the platforms to raise funds that would then transfer through the workers. So I think we go back to the issues that we had before COVID to ensure that the platforms are viable and that we can create a safe environment for the workers to continue to thrive.
Thanks very much. And Michelle. Michelle, sorry.
Yeah, maybe to add one, as Anna has said, I think regulation is still a big part. I know like in Kenya this year, they introduced the digital tax, but still people don't know what does that mean? At what point should they actually be able to do the tax? So I think that's still a risk in terms of regulation, just knowing what are the aspects that needs to be regulated. Are gig workers employees versus are gig workers self-employment people? So understanding that and making sure that the right regulations comes in place is really important, and kind of big risk for the sector as well.
Yeah, if I may add to what Michelle and Izana have already said, I think for me, I think COVID's accelerated what we have been seeing as inevitable. And I think some of these changes will probably last for a long time. And I do think that all of our institutions, like what we've been saying earlier, have been really configured for 100-year-old past. And I think we're no longer living in that past. We are very much in the future of work already. It's upon us. So I think reconfiguring institutions, from education institutions to financial institutions, like we talked about earlier, and government, both Michelle and Izana have mentioned, I think is really critical. I think also positioning young people for the future of work in terms of digital skills and readiness, I think is also really critical. So the future is here. So it's just for us and institutions that are a little bit outdated to actually catch up to the future, which has just been accelerated by COVID.
I think those are really great points. I think COVID has both shown up some particular challenges and weaknesses in the gig economy to do with COVID, but it's also opened our eyes in many respects on many of the other risks that there are there. And hopefully, Danielle, that answers some of your question about some of the concrete areas we can focus on. We can come back to that. I think something else, and we've talked about this quite a lot in this call about what COVID has really brought to light, especially talking about the future being here now, is if we can come back to this idea of the digital divide. I think we have some questions here. Maybe I can, pass it under the digital divide. So Khalid Yahya asks, do you have any strategy for incorporating rural populace to the basic IT technologies to pave way for them to becoming employed by gig companies and organizations? Or Jennifer earlier on says, do you have any strategies in mind for moving people over to digital platforms for job gig information? I think you all have a wonderful perspective on this, but maybe let's go in reverse to maybe start with Sharmi.
Sure. I think, when we were talking about going online and old school, I think old school is really critical. So we've discovered that SMS and USSD platforms are actually quite critical in reaching people without smartphones and without data access. But you actually cannot solve some of this without solving both the infrastructure as well as the smartphone and access issues. So I think that it has to be multi-pronged. So people who develop products and owners of platforms need to be digitally inclusive and mindful of who they're reaching and their target population. So people that they want to get on board, you do have to adapt to those populations. But people with a more systemic lens and funders and social impact organizations also have to work on the digital infrastructure as well as the data costs. It kind of has to be multi-pronged. And data is almost like a basic human right. And I think COVID's kind of shown that. And I think if we are to really include economies, people at the bottom of the pyramid in the future of work, it's critical that we actually address it from all angles.
Michelle?
I think that's an excellent question. It's something that we're still be grappling about as BFA and Catalyst Fund. So one project we are trying actually to test right now is saying, can digital centers or cyber cafes be an entry and gateway point to moving people, or especially in the rural areas, into the platform system? So if I am someone in rural Kenya, I'm able to actually go to a cyber cafe within the village and be able actually to access. So that is something we're testing out, and hopefully soon we'll start having data on that. But I think it's a really interesting model of how to try to get people. The biggest challenge we've had from a lot of the low-income people, and especially in the rural areas, is data is expensive, which we've been mentioning also about on this cost and in this call. So how do we ensure that we are able to reduce the cost so that more people are able to go online and be able to access these services? So that's still a huge barrier that people have in terms of getting on board as well. Thanks.
And then, I like Sharmi's point around the old school. So I do think that's part of the answer. And humans are great interfaces for other humans. So we've invested quite significantly behind our call center so that anybody can call and we can translate the request for the service provider that may have more challenges. So I heard the question was around rural workers, but even in urban areas. So some of the domestic workers that we work with in the cleaning disinfection don't have smartphones and don't have data access. So we invest quite significantly behind the call center where you have people that the service providers can talk to. Even on the user side, it's something that has additional value. So I think some of our investors are not so keen on the fact that it's a less scalable platform in terms of having people responding to questions. But in many ways, if the challenge is how do you provide broad reach and broad access, there is I guess it's an old school solution, but it does address the problem quite nicely. So I think that's one thing that we can all, I guess, learn from.
Thanks very much. I think there's a lot of agreement there. We have about 10 minutes left, so if anyone would like to share some questions, we'd love to see them, and you have a great panel here to answer them. The next question is in from Stephen David, and I'm gonna, maybe I'll interpret it or push it my own way. But he says, have you seen youth retention wages lowered due to COVID? And what can organizations do to rapidly avoid a race to the bottom on gig opportunities? So I think there's one part there is about the impacts of COVID, which grateful if people can talk about again, but we've covered that a bit. But perhaps I'd like to twist that a bit and say, where do you see things in the future? Where do you see gig work in the future? Do you see that on the platforms we've been talking about, work will get worse and worse? There'll be so much pressure that wages will be driven down for workers. Or do you see perhaps a more positive alternative? Conditions are getting better on platforms. Workers have to have more influence on how platforms work. Maybe, Ezana, what do you think? If you look in a crystal ball, what do you see?
So we're on the platform side. So certainly I think we need to compete. And I think the way we do so is by providing better conditions for the workers on the platform itself. So certainly on our end, the idea of providing a safety net, both from a healthcare perspective. We talked about financial guarantees of insurance on that side, being able to provide training, being able to have access to tools. So one small example would be we bring in in one category, for example, plumbers. So we do some additional training on top of the vocational schools to give them skills, but they come to us and they don't have the tools to start the work, which is a challenge. So being able to provide access to that, the financing to do it. So I of course, there's the other side that say there may be a race to the bottom, but I think that from our perspective, you do need to compete for the time of the service provider. So investing more behind the services that we provide, and then the income, I think, is the only way that we create loyalty. So I don't know. I tend to be, so we're on this side, we tend to be optimistic around what we have to do, but it's not easy, and certainly investment required, but certainly a need to continue improving the conditions is what we see.
And I actually tend to agree with Ezana as well. I think what COVID has shown us is the vulnerability we have in the system. And I've seen more and more platforms saying, okay, clearly this model is not working. Like, we need to have to put in the social protection aspect. So we need to have at least social care, having health insurance, having savings products, and the trainings that Ezana has mentioned. So I think this was an opportunity for people to see where the gaps are. And now I think in future is trying to make sure that those gaps are filled. So in my sense, when I think about future, I'll see a lot of partnerships with also other organizations, because the platform cannot be able to provide anything. So there is an aspect of how can fintechs come in and support the platform so that they're able to actually deliver better services for both their gig workers and the end consumer.
I mean, I'm not going to add something that's very different, but I think maybe just one additional point is that I think the employment contract perhaps has to be revisited entirely. It's no longer sort of a bilateral thing between employer and the gig worker. I do think it has to be reconfigured almost entirely, and the government has a role to play. Because it's unfair just for platforms to take on the responsibility for fair work, etc. Because it's a new kind of work, and I do think our government, to Michelle's point around social protection, insurance, etc. I think think tanks can help see good ideas, but I think governments really have a role to play in understanding how do you build robust social protection institutions for the future of work that can also incentivize value creation for the platforms and job opportunities for the gig workers. That has to be government has to be involved in that conversation, because it isn't just fair for the market to decide, because you will inevitably have a race to the bottom because of that. So I do think to align incentives, you do have to have government as part of that conversation and understand, okay, what assets are being created, who creates the value, how does it get distributed, and how do you protect sort of the rights of the workers at the core.
So I want to follow up on that point. That's something I've been thinking about. We had a question earlier. How can we do that? How can we all different market actors with our different perspectives, how can we work better with the government? What should we be doing? I mean, one thing is next time we have a call like this, make sure we have someone. But Shami, maybe we can start with you. I know your work, especially in South Africa, you're working very, very closely with the government. What lessons do you have, or what can you say on this?
I mean, I think for us, partnership with government is core to our work. And I think looking at a couple of things. One is, government's going to take care of people for whom the market doesn't have a solution. And I think it's imperative. It's not and it's not just charity. It actually makes, economic growth work for everyone. So I think from an inclusion perspective, government has an obligation to do that. But I think it's important to invite government to have conversations with private sector as well, to understand how do you incentivize good business growth that leads to job opportunities being created in the future. So I think that's a critical conversation with government. It's not just about social security and benefits and protection, but also about job growth. And I think importantly, I think government is I've been reading a lot of this economist Mariana Mazzucato, who talks about government as actually funding entrepreneurship. In many ways, Uber and all of these platforms in the United States benefited greatly from government investment on GPS, and I think for us to undermine the role in government for the sort of platform economy is misguided. I think it's difficult in places like the African continent where you don't have a huge tax base. So those are interesting conversations that need to be thought about. Where do you get funding for some of this? But we have to have government being involved. And I think government also has a role to play in saying, how do you make opportunities like gig work visible to young people? So Ajira, the platform that the Kenyan government's partnering on to help mobilize, I think is a very great example in Kenya, for example. So those would be some suggestions.
And maybe to add on that, I think as we talked about, regulation is still a really big part. And who drives regulation? It's the government. So having conversations with the government from the beginning as platforms trying to create these jobs and everything, it helps in that having an open conversation and knowing what are the rights of the gig workers. How do we ensure that they're able to still pay taxes to the government, but also in the process have the benefits that is required of them or anything like that. So I think having that open conversation and why we need to have government is to help protect both the platform, but also the gig workers themselves.
Thank you. And Azana, what's your situation? Are you working with the government? Or what's your take on this?
Yeah, yes, we are. So I think that we're fortunate to have been included in a task force in Ethiopia that's run by the Job Creation Commission, which sits under the Prime Minister. And they've included a sort of a task force that includes both public sector as well as private sector operators, with quite an ambitious sort of mandate, to look at all these conditions. So the regulatory constraints that obviously is the government side, looking at the investment, sort of any hurdles in terms of driving investment, looking at some of the challenges we're facing, crowding in some resources as well. So it's early stage, so it's just been formed, and it has a mandate over the next 3 months to come up with a framework that makes it both safe for gig workers, but also looking at the regulatory constraints that are in place and see if we can tackle those. So I do think it's a good example. So again, it's early stage. We'll see where we come out, but I do think it's a good model for how to address some of the things that Charmy and Michelle talked about in terms of looking at his entire ecosystem, as opposed to the players working independently and then ending up maybe not taking advantage of the limited resources to go further than they could together.
Okay, great. Really, really great to hear that. I hope people feel their questions have been answered. Please just put into the chat if you have any follow-up questions or you agree or disagree. I think we probably have time maybe for 2 or 3 questions left. So I'm going to ask one of them. But I think a couple of the questions are going to get me thinking along this way. So in Stephen's question on race to the bottom, I think as an NGO, this is something at Mercy Corps, we feel, we see the system, perhaps we can have a small, important role nudging the system a certain way. And Danielle asked about what are some of the concrete capacities that would increase preparedness in the gig economy. So the question is, what value add can development actors provide to the work that other actors are doing, such as NGOs, such as Mercy Corps, others, some of yourselves? Yeah, what can development partners, what value can we provide? Zana, it's a quick one for you.
So we learn a lot from development partners. So we work with Mercy Corps, the Inclusive Lab, as well as Mercy Corps in Ethiopia. And so on our side, we learn a lot. So, for example, as we did this intervention around providing work to cleaning domestic workers, a lot of the criteria around how we deploy the resources to the workers was driven by the development partner. So in this case, Mercy Corps. So in fact, we learned a lot and made sure that we put in the right conditions for the service for the gig workers to be able to work to have dignified work. And so I think what will be creative is, as we look at raising investment funds to grow the platforms, I do think that the development partners play a key role. Both in our case, what we've seen is they've helped us to make sure that the conditions were optimal for the gig workers on the platform. So they helped us establish the conditions. But I do think even that from as opposed to traditional venture capital, I think that tapping into, and this is the benefit we've had, is tapping into some of the development financing to help grow the platforms as well as the conditions for the service providers, I think is probably unique in the African context, and what we've seen is the development partners do have a key role to play in creating sort of the right environment.
I guess for me, I see the role of development partners in three ways. One is creating awareness. So outside from urban and peri-urban areas, how do you start creating awareness about this platform in the rural areas? And I feel like development partners have a lot of experience in the rural areas. So how do we enable that? But also, how do people access it? Is there a way we can do like integrate into your existing programs that development partners have to show like this is a different way of doing things, or like now having a platform as part of a delivery services, they reach out to people? And then thirdly, which I think kind of talks about how do you make it more affordable, right? So one of the key challenges, people say, okay, if I want to get on the platform, what are the costs of investment to just get on the platform? Is there a way we're able to actually do it cheaper? If it's, for example, have smartphone financing, so somebody is able to actually access a smartphone, how do you able to do that? So I feel like there are different ways of the development partners helping, but just to kind of create that past barrier of how to onboard people into the platform, either as a gig worker or even just as a customer, because even the more you have customers, then the more likely this is there's a demand for it, then the platform comes. But how do we start creating that?
I feel like my colleagues have really spoken about the key insights. I mean, Mercycorps, for example, does a great job of sort of releasing your reports on, for example, the gig work economy and in many contexts. And I think those insights are incredibly valuable for practitioners and people in the field, as well as governments and policymakers. Maybe to be slightly sort of not controversial, but just to suggest that I think we could do a lot more to be on two fronts. Maybe development partners and funders in particular could be a lot more systems oriented rather than necessarily focused on traditional mechanisms of reporting, etc. I think a lot of times you see, organizations reporting on inputs when now we actually have to focus on job creation and matching and placements, etc. And I think we do have to shift that conversation. And I think if there was one push that I would request for the development community, in particular funders, to make, I think it's really important to shift towards outputs and understanding, okay, are we improving livelihoods? Are we actually making a difference? Are we not just skilling for the sake of skilling, for example? So I think that would be sort of one consideration. And I think the second would be systems views. Again, we live in very sort of complex interconnected systems, and not a single intervention here can't make a difference. So I do think development partners have a rich perspective, just being outside the box, but also having an overview of everything that's going on. They could provide the insights, but also help shape the conversation to actually direct the system. So just some thoughts to mull over there.
Shamli, perfect. You're speaking my language. I fully agree with those needed changes to the work of the development partners. So I think we just have a couple minutes left. Sorry, Jennifer, we couldn't get to your final question, but hopefully that the response to your earlier one was great. So can I just ask our panelists if they would like to say a final couple words or thoughts on the topic of how to improve the resilience of the gig economy and for gig workers in particular. Anyone can go.
I can start then. Sure. Yeah, I mean, as I've said, and as many of us have emphasized, I think the future of work is here, and I think it's the gig space, and we shouldn't treat it as sort of like on the margins. We actually need to mainstream it. And what does that mean? All of our institutions need to mainstream an understanding of how to serve gig work, how to improve the productivity, how to make social protections happen for every single institution, whether it's education institutions that encourage side hustles, not just teach entrepreneurship. Financial products need to be tailored to gig workers. Governments need to be thinking about it. So we need to rewire our economies around gig work because it is the future.
I think she actually took the words. Yeah, the future is here. That's what we'll be talking about. I think for a couple of years, we've been talking about future of work, but now the future is here. And what it has shown us this year was the potential of gig work. I feel like, yes, now there's a chance of us making sure that this is the right way, and it's the right now it's the opportunity to make sure like all those social protection is done, regulation is correct, but also like the systems and the ecosystem is actually working better to continue with this gig work, because we feel like that's also like where the future is, or the future is going to be. So how do we make sure that it's beneficial for both the platforms, but also for the gig workers themselves?
Yeah, and my final point was just to commend you for putting this session together, because I do find that when we all seem to address the same sort of types of challenges in our different markets, countries, categories, and I think that when you look at maybe the Western world, the knowledge sharing ends up being more efficient. So I think sessions like this, where we're looking at sharing not just within each of our markets or countries, but looking across the continent at what are sort of systemic challenges that we can address together, I think will help us move faster and maybe, again, get more mileage from the limited resources that we have. So again, just want to thank you for organizing this session. And I think that more of these kinds of forums where we can see what's going on in the different countries and see how we can learn both across the private side and the public side are very helpful and very needed.
Well, thanks very much. I definitely agree with that, and I feel like I've learned so much from our distinguished panelists here. So a really big thanks to them. Hopefully everyone will stick around for the next session, and the final session. It's called The Future of Work. I think, as we've discussed here, it should probably be renamed to, I think, The Present of Work or something like that. So yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in, and I look forward to staying in touch. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.